Thank you so much, Ram, for the introduction. Of course, thank you to Carlos and Angela for the invitation to participate in the program. I've looked at the speakers, and it's really nice to be alongside some of the people that influenced me, or at least I've been in conversation with. So um, I'm jealous of you residents that get to stitch it all together. I'm going to present kind of a new talk today, as I was talking to people before the lecture, so bear with me. This is not one I've done before. I'm just going to really talk through my current project and kind of show how it formed and how it resulted in some exhibitions and publications at the current moment. And then hopefully we're going to do some Q&A, because I'd love to hear some questions or answer some of the behind the scenes or kind of some of the ramifications or complications of it, because it really is quite a large research project more than anything. And that research project I titled Under the Desert Turned to Glass. This is actually a title that comes from a mixtape, I would say, actually. Oh, I have a recording thing. I need to try to get, there we go. Okay, great. It comes from a time I was in Marfa, Texas, in resident there in 2012. And it's a high altitude desert, for those who don't know, or are not familiar with the Chinati Foundation or the Donald Judd Foundation. It's a high altitude desert right on the border between Chihuahua and Texas. And closest places are Juarez and El Paso. So it's an amazing landscape. I have a proclivity towards deserts, either in the Arctic or high altitude deserts like Marfa, just because of the landscape really reveals a deep time. It's one of these landscapes where you can really sense the age of things. Unlike, let's say, the jungle or other places where time seems to be very liquid and very alive. We really get a sense of deep time in the desert. And so it really formed a certain body of work, which I've been continuing since then. The Desert Turned to Glass is a title. Actually, I don't really mention this very often, but it was originally a radio show or mixtape I did in Marfa City when I was in Marfa, Texas, when I was there. And it's a poetic way of describing when a meteorite hits the desert. And that energy from the meteorite fuses the sand, the silica in the ground on the earth, and turns it into glass. There's a technical term for that, and it's called tektite. But I prefer the more poetic expression of the desert turns to glass. It happens in two other occasions. Once when lightning hits the ground, and you're seeing some pictures from Marfa, Texas. And the other time, of course, is when the nuclear explosion happened in Trinity. This is the White Sands military proving ground, which is right beside West Texas there on the border with New Mexico. And when the first nuclear explosion occurred at Trinity, the desert underneath of it was also melted into glass. It's actually called trinitite. Various places, for instance, natural history museums actually collect it as kind of a mineral crystal. And that nuclear explosion kind of, in a way, as like people like to talk about today, is really our marker of us kind of changing the geological record. And some people believe the nuclear explosion at Trinity really marked that occasion. Either way, I'm very interested in how humans have changed the climate, which I'll get to in a moment. But at this moment in Marfa, I was really looking at all these moments of really when the desert turned to glass. Also, one of the first meteorites ever studied or turned as a crater was in Texas, Odessa, Texas. And so there was all these kinds of ideas together. And the first artwork in the current body of work will show the desert turned to glass is the same. It's a titular work called The Desert Turned to Glass, which is a floating meteorite, which I'll kind of show at the end of the talk. But it was kind of first set up and conceived here in 2012 in Texas. It's also the other thread, I guess, because I'm trying to pull some themes together, really some background, was the aspect of stars gazing. The Fort Worth, Texas is also one of the darkest skies in the continental America. Of course, Hawaii, Canary Islands, Chile, these places are really great, very remote places for observatories, telescopes, but one of the darkest places in the actual continental US is West Texas. And so there's a beautiful star observatory there, which documents a lot of the sky. So you can really see the cosmos coming down into the desert. and kind of see this idea of the Earth as part of a planetary system very clearly in these locations. So it was at this time while I was doing the residency there, I actually lived in Dawson City, Yukon. Dawson City is the famous gold rush town at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And I lived there starting a art school for the indigenous government, the Chthonic, and the state college at the time, kind of a first collaboration between indigenous people and the state government, which was kind of important at the time because, as has come out since then in the popular press, probably internationally, maybe even to Italy, is the kind of genocidal act of residential schools. So there's a long history in Canada through colonialism of assimilating First Nations children. And so there's kind of a bad history. So this was actually the first project where First Nations government and the university got together to create a new model of education. And it was under the arts. So I was there to help co-fund that in 2007 and living there during this time while I was doing this residency. And I really had this experience, like I was saying, in the desert. Again, this is another very dry place where the separation between the terrestrial and the celestial really is not as clear as one thinks when you're in the city or you're in more populated places, whether it's northern lights or the stars or the 24-hour darkness. One really feels they're in outer space a lot of the times. The work you're looking at is called the Distant Early Warning Project. And it's one of my earlier works coming out of grad school that really looked at the history of the Cold War as a case study for something called the Warm War, or the coming war between sovereign states over natural resources due to climate change. So this is the term I was kind of kicking around back in about 2008. And so I created a remote radio station in the Arctic, but instead of the radio station, which historically listened to obviously Russian bombers and military craft, I kind of flipped it and it was listening to the melting sounds of ice. So inside this geodesic dome, there was hydrophones that were frozen into the ice and through the ice, and they were doing a field recording and then kind of bouncing them through through radio waves to my studio and then onto the internet, so you could listen to kind of the melting ice in real time around the world. So these were back around 2007, 2008, then 2009, this project was being built and kind of run. Back when it was first conceived that Department of Defense was saying that climate change would be a coming military concern because of global unrest. And so it was here that I kind of started this methodology that I referred to in the bio, which is field work. It's a term, of course, we're all familiar with through ethnographic studies or laboratory studies. I really kind of wanted to appropriate that term, much like the concept of installation. Just like we say installation art today, it's very common as a genre. I was trying to say that field work should be appropriated as a type of artwork, much in a way that an everyday term gets flipped into a very specific art genre. And so I'll just read the definition, which I kind of set up at that time, which really established basically fieldwork as a methodology and as an art form itself. So fieldwork engages with the geographic site, but then warps one's perception of the space, comparable to a mathematical strange attractor, sharing on the one hand the history of art installation, which can modulate the encompassing architecture and the viewer's phenomenological perception, and on the other hand, the history of the site-specific or earthwork art, which amplifies the place's story or materiality. Fieldwork creates its own temporary architecture within a space or in a landscape. However, such a landscape need not be natural, and architecture may not always be a traditional shelter or sculpture. It can be composed of sonic material, electromagnetic fields, light fluctuations, or relationships. At its core, a fieldwork is dynamic and geospatial. And this really came out of the material practice. Obviously, I was traveling across the Arctic, documenting military stations, looking at the birth of radio broadcasts, and creating an actual radio station itself. So I really took the practice of field recordings and creating magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, radio fields, and pulling that all together to kind of create this distant early warning project. And that really kind of kicked a process that is still the methodology that I'm working with today, that really feeds into the Desert Turned to Glass project. So it also kicked off this long-term research on domes, which is kind of the architectural container for the current project. Buckminster Fuller, of course, built these geodesic domes with the American military in the 1950s in the Canadian Arctic. But of course, we know Buckminster Fuller more for the domes we're looking at here, the counterculture domes of the 1960s, of the utopian hippie communes. And most famously, of course, the one that's burning in the background of this museum installation I did, the Expo 67 dome in Montreal. I was commissioned in, I guess it was 2017, the 50th anniversary of Expo, to do an archival exhibition looking at the history of Expo 67. And I traced the history of Buckminster Fuller's engineering of the geodesic dome through its kind of dark military past through to the more contemporary pop ideas of spaceship Earth, and of course, the geodesic dome of the Expo kind of experimental pavilion, which is so common today. In the middle of that image, you'll actually see a geodesic dome made out of copper. This is actually a radio antenna inside of the dome, and that actually mirrored the on-site. Well, we had the museum exhibition at the Muséum d'Art Contemporain, the MAC in Montreal. I actually electrified the original architecture, creating an entire geodesic antenna. So we electrified the entire building to be a broadcast of space sounds, pulsars, which was discovered in 1967, the same year the dome was built, some lectures from Buckminster Fuller, and about 2 days worth of radio broadcasting that looped for about 4 months during the exhibition. It was during that time, though, I actually discovered that the geodesic dome wasn't created by Buckminster Fuller, even though he's the popular. It was actually created in Germany in the 1920s by the Zeiss company. We all know Zeiss, of course, as artists because of their lenses for photography. They created the first planetarium. And in order to do that, on the factory roof of in Jena, they created this membrane that could be, I guess, light enough to be on the roof. And of course, it's not an accident that a optical company that had the mathematics to precisely engineer curved lenses became the company that had the mathematics to actually design a building that was perfectly spherical, according to geodesics. So it was kind of this idea of looking at the planetarium that kind of first started piquing my interest, not just as a geodesic dome as a military structure, but also as this imaging architecture. And then a couple of years later in 2019, I was invited to be the curator of the video and sound art program for the inaugural Toronto Biennial of Art. And I curated a program called The Drowned World based on Ballard's Ballard's book, The Drowned World, kind of the very first climate fiction novel ever written in 1962, I believe. And so he kind of established the genre that's picked up today by Kim Stanley Robinson and a lot of other artists that look at science fiction as a critique or as a looking at scenarios playing out of hard science realities of the world. So I looked at water and the drowned world and kind of looked at his imagination of a future where climate change really has global effects and the kind of human consequences, societal consequences of that. Of course, this was a curated show of several artists, and it was put in this dome, which you're looking at now, which is the birthplace of IMAX. Many people don't know, but IMAX is a Canadian invention. So I was, again, kind of tracing the history of architecture and media through Canadian landscapes. And this building built by Eb Zeidler was the original home for IMAX as this kind of projection cinema dome. So it's very specific to have this floating island, or artificial island with this dome kind of on it floating on the Great Lakes of Toronto as the birthplace of this, of the ultimate spectacle within media history that continues on to today. This played into the aspect of domes in general, which really piqued my curiosity as getting deeper and deeper into this. Not just geodesic domes of the military, not just geodesic domes of spectacle, of the planetarium and IMAX, but I started really looking at the deep history of these. So for the current book that is coming out this month with Haji Khan's, I really started looking at the history of domes, starting with prehistoric caves, leading all through the original Pantheon and, of course, religious architecture, up through early scientific ideas and military experimentations, through to the final kind of radio observatories and even deep matter laboratories. The image you're seeing in the bottom right corner was built in the last few years here in Ontario, very close to the University of Toronto, It's 2 kilometers beneath the Earth's surface. It's a dark matter research lab to detect neutrinos. And so again, we kind of return to the cavern, the subterranean. So the first image on the top is a Paleolithic cave that I'll show in a little bit in the film, which is some of the earliest cave art in the world, and kind of the subterranean is kind of our most recent cavernous dome structure. And there's something in there that I was very obsessed with of humans being drawn to these dark spherical dome spaces as spiritual places, as places of imagining the world and the cosmos beyond. There's something formal about it, the darkness. There's something formal about the spherical roof, the acoustics of it, that became really important to me. Of course, I'm borrowing a little bit from Peter Sloterdijk and his Spheres trilogy, if there's some philosophers in the audience that have read that series of work. It's really brilliant, and Peter really talks about 2 types of spheres. He talks about kind of the sphere that has outward pressure, and so from the center it radiates out and creates this architecture. And then there's the other kind where it's compression, let's say like the arch based. So we have kind of 2 dynamic forces that are happening that he kind of lines up in the history of architecture, the pantheon being this kind of pantheistic idea that then converts into a religious Islamic or Christian medieval cathedral situation. But I feel what he missed was a more modern component of that had a third way, which was the geodesic dome. The geodesic dome is not based on an arch compression of gravitational ideas, nor is it based on an inflationary aspect, or let's say inflatables of outward pressure that pushes out for the dome. It's based on its actual lattice structure itself. It's a very unique structure of tension, compression, or tensegrity, where actually the structure or the shell, because of its geodesic shape, maintains its structure that way. So it's neither about internal pressure or external gravity, which maintains it, which allows it to be, obviously, as we know, very useful in space operations or in military operations or extreme geographical locations. So it was within that I kind of had done this research that I was invited to do a work for the 100th anniversary of the planetarium. As I said, it was created in 1922-23 of the Zeiss factory. And so when the 100th anniversary came up this last year, I really wanted to do something interesting about it. And I was invited by a planetarium that turned into a state contemporary art Kunsthalle in Canada to create a new work, a new commission for them. So this is a new text that kind of translated by Benjamin for the current book, which is called To the Planetarium. He wrote it on the birth of the original piece of architecture. And it really became kind of a spiritual or philosophical guide for the project, where we're looking at how we reconnect to the cosmos and what humans kind of lose with this optical astronomy aspect of connecting to the stars or the universe versus the spiritual energy of the cosmos as we connect to the world around us. Of course, he's writing this after the First World War and the trauma of this kind of extractive imperialistic ideas of nature and dominance over nature that results, of course, in the Great Wars. And he's trying to kind of critique that in a way and look at our society within this kind of longer, deeper time. It's a very small essay, but it's a very important one to me. So leading up to this idea of creating something for the planetarium, it was COVID. So a lot of people, probably like me, were either in lockdown or they were out in the countryside as much as possible. I was very fortunate to be able to roam deserts and different landscapes. So I returned kind of back to a lot of earlier practice, which was field recordings and field performances. So I actually started doing one of these classic traces through the American Midwest to look at land art through Utah, Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona, tracing and looking at these various locations for a few different reasons. One was, of course, Robert Smithson, land art people were very influential, I think, to contemporary art as we look at ecology today. Of course, they weren't ecologists themselves. They were still looking at ideas of landscape in a very appropriatory, a very manifest destiny way. But yet, they obviously got us looking outside of the gallery and looking at the landscape. So I wanted to visit these pieces and kind of document them, of course, from an aerial perspective, which is one of the ways these things were built for. You just saw Double Negative by Michael Heiser. This is one that doesn't get a lot of press or images, but this is by Nancy Holt, called Sun Tunnels. This was actually filmed on the solstice, where the sun actually aligns through the tunnels, and it's an interesting star map. So again, she's a very important, one of the only feminist land artists that kind of is in the canon. Not always visited because it's a little bit farther than some of the other ones, but a beautiful landscape there in Utah on the Salt Flats, just outside Salt Lake City. Of course, it would, I wanted to look at these, like I say, for art historical purposes, but I also wanted to look at them as indexes, very indexical signifiers of how the landscape changes. I wanted to look at not only how these land arts cut into the earth, let's say like Michael Heiser, in a sense they made marks directly in the landscape, but also how over time, in the 50 years, 60 years since they were created, how they also were becoming markers of how the landscape had changed. So how much humans immediately changed them in these grand kind of gestures, but also how climate change, which is another human change of the landscape, also marked them, or even more in a microclimate, sometimes drought. So what you're looking at now, of course, is the Spiral Jetty, which I had to also visit, by Robert Smithson in 1971. And it's been submerged and completely at one point by the rising tide, or rising level of the Salt Lake, which doesn't have tides, more kind of metaphorical rising tide. And then, of course, nowadays, because of the drought in America, the drought in Utah, not necessarily climate change, it's a little bit closer to an anthro change, but again, I don't necessarily, those aren't separated. Our use of the landscape, whether it's on a large scale climate or whether it's on a local drought, again, is us as humans interacting with nature. So these landscape works, because of their scale, because of the location, really become indexes of this landscape we're in. So these were more studies. What you've seen in our artworks, these are just some, this is more of a diary of me traveling and looking at it and shooting, looking at the studies of it. But of course they fed into what I was making and doing the planetarium. At one point we thought we'd put them in, but my producer Ali Rasha on the film I Have Silence definitely told me not to put them in, which I think was a wise decision. And kind of look at them as influential, but not referential. At the same time, or not the same time, around the same time, again, it was still COVID, I ended up tracing Robert Smithson's journeys to the Yucatan. He has a famous work called Travels to the Yucatan. And so we continued with that, and I kind of started doing a lot of cave diving. Again, looking at closed spaces, it was COVID, so these ideas of hermetic bubbles, this idea of being contained, these sealed spaces was very interesting. So I kind of went very extreme and started scuba diving into these locations, started to map them with LiDAR, to look at them as kind of objects in themselves, as these spaces. Also started doing sound recordings, and then I started doing impulse response recordings, so I could reverb map them. So I had kind of a spatial map of them through LiDAR, and then an acoustic map through impulse responses. And these became studies for these hermetic spaces, these caves, these caverns, as well as these kind of portals to the underworld, and kind of looking at these. I was commissioned by the Tay Foundation in Mexico then to create a sound installation / concert. And so this is a 4-hour kind of deep listening session, which used this cenote. For those who don't know, cenote is a underwater cavern, kind of what I was showing you earlier. So these caves that were created in the Yucatan by the meteorite crashing into the earth. So the grand dinosaur killing meteorite hit in Chicxulub, which is on the Gulf of Mexico, which is the Yucatan, and it fractured the entire peninsula. And that bedrock of the entire peninsula was fractured so much that the water is all these underwater streams and caverns. And so they call these underwater caves cenotes. And here's an example what James Turrell has renovated into an amphitheater. So I was invited to kind of use his amphitheater as a instrument itself. So we actually had the subwoofer kind of tuned in place so we could use the resonant chamber that black strip actually goes backwards and then underwater. So we used that as a resonant chamber for the listening station, for the listening concert. and kind of use that as part of this geological performance. This is where I wanted to shift from not only doing field recordings, but into something called field performances, where we're actually using the landscape, we're using geological features as part of the performance itself. And so I started doing a series of these. Another one I was invited in Lanzarote, Canary Islands, where we used a volcanic tube, actually. So the concert was inside the volcanic tube, and we used the volcanic tube as the sound channel to sculpt, and the audience was then inside the volcanic channel to listen to the concert. Eventually ends up in the planetarium dome. And this was the opening concert for the show called The Desert Turned to Glass. So this, my kind of long intro, though it's not really an intro, it's kind of what I'm trying to reveal here is a method, resulted in an exhibition called The Desert Turned to Glass within this planetarium that started to incorporate all of these things together into one ecology. So these concerts actually was started as just a deep listening sensation of field recordings, field performances, turned into actually the soundtrack to a film, which was the commission to be played in the planetarium dome itself. And the film's called The Eye of Silence. It's a kind of 3 video projection that wraps around the dome with a 7.1 channel surround track, and is a half-an-hour film that really looks the birth of life and consciousness within a deep time context. It would seem fitting, of course, for a planetarium architecture repurposed for an art gallery. The invitation to do the show was a really unique opportunity. And what I mean by that is that there's not a lot of times you get to use a piece of architecture as a specific site in itself, looking at the history, which is very interesting. Most galleries are usually in white cubes, or in some kind of colonial palace or some kind of Beaux-Arts situation. So to be able to use a planetarium as a contemporary art space is very unique in itself. And 2, to be able to take over the whole architecture was great. So I was literally able to create a microcosm of the world through the architecture. And what you'll see diagrammatically here is kind of a cross-section of that architecture. So the top, which was the cosmic aspect, was exhibited over the dome. And then directly underneath of it, the subterranean aspect of that space, I was able to create a cavernous, dark space, which was a subterranean, and look at 2 different theories of the origin of life. One theory was that meteorites came down and seeded the earth through its amino acids. And I'm doing a talk tomorrow with a polymer scientist on the origin of life in the deep biosphere at the University of Toronto. And so one of these ideas is that life just didn't spontaneously erupt in some amino acid pool of volcanic pools, which is very interesting, but rather actually it's the meteorites that came down, created the atmosphere by bombarding the earth and creating and releasing the water that was inside the mantle, and then the crust, and then actually creating an atmosphere and then seeding that earth through the meteorites. And then the other one is that actually the possibility in the deep biosphere, away from the energy of the sun, deep in the recesses of the earth, it was actually the resident gravitational and nuclear aspects of the core of the earth that actually radiates the heat out that life evolved. We don't really know, and the cycle of the earth and the mantle has gone through, but this idea that life didn't necessarily emerge on the surface, but in the subterranean. So this exhibition kind of placed these 2 theories together in one kind of model of a dome space above and a dome space below. In between those 2, and I call one the cosmic and the chthonic, kind of the upper and the lower aspects, splitting, of course, into a very kind of dualistic shamanism. The in between them, of course, is the collision, and that's a meteorite that kind of enters, and that was through this the atrium, through kind of the stairwell that collides, and I'll show you that in a moment. I just wanted to give you kind of a map of the exhibition before I go through the individual works and kind of talk about those. So here's a quick install shot of the installation itself. It's your kind of classic stadium seating with the parabolic screen. And like I said, the film's called The Eye of Silence, and kind of looked at this idea of the origin of life. We filmed the film on 4 different continents. We filmed in Iceland. We filmed in Japan. We filmed, of course, all across the continental U.S. desert. We filmed also in the Canary Islands, and we filmed in Namibia, and in Africa, Southern Africa. And there's reasons for all of these places. They're very specific. Primarily, we were chasing volcanoes, active volcanoes. So whether it was La Palma or in Iceland or in Japan. And looking at kind of, like I was saying, these kind of formation of the earth and these kind of powerful moments of the earth creating. We were also trying to, if we were creating a film about the origin of life, we couldn't have any life on the screen. And you'll be surprised how difficult that is. There's life everywhere. It's a very fecund planet. And so there's always a little bush, a little bit of grass, a little bit of moss somewhere. So it's actually very hard to find barren earth. And even, of course, if you were to look into the soil of these places, they're full of life underneath. But even just visually speaking, to tell this narrative, it's hard to find these barren landscapes. Volcanoes are one of these places, of course, because it's such a fresh earth. So the narrative itself starts out as this kind of, like I said, narrative of a meteorite crashing into Earth. And so we look at this idea of, and I'll just kind of just mention, it's a science fiction film in the sense of aesthetics. It's a half an hour long, it's abstract. The soundtrack itself is actually the concert from these geological sites. So it's a very kind of, it's a noise kind of drone concert. So it's a very kind of overwhelming sonic experience with again, the surround sound sculpting the space itself with these reverb models. So I'm not playing sound today because I'm going to continue talking, and I'm assuming most people are just kind of using headphones or watching their laptop anyway. So we'll kind of save that for a day when hopefully you can see the show itself. So we start with this meteorite. I'm using a specific meteorite, which landed in the Canadian landscape. Canada actually had the only, until this last month, and the Band-Aid recovery mission, which is a kind of our first recovery of meteorite, the only frozen meteorite to ever be salvaged was in the Canadian Arctic. And that's because it landed in the border of the Yukon, where I was used to living, and BC. And it landed while someone was ice fishing in a lake that was frozen. And the fisherman was smart enough to grab it quickly and put it in his freezer and call scientists, and they came up and recovered it. So it's actually here in Toronto at the Royal Ontario Museum, which is one of the world's premier research center for meteorites. And so we have this kind of frozen. They haven't even figured out how to study it yet, because all of the procedures to study meteorites are when they've already been thawed, because most of them, they land in a desert when you find them, or they're very old from previous landings. And so you're looking at a meteorite that's already at room temperature. So they have a lot of it still in the bio vault, frozen, looking at waiting to figure out a cryo process to analyze without destroying the meteorite or destroying what is in the meteorite as a frozen kind of aspect. And of course, the reason why I'm so obsessed with frozen meteorites because of ice crystals, and wherever there's water, everyone freaks out because that's the possibility of detecting traces of life. So it's a very unique kind of history in Canada of meteorites, which I've also been looking at. The one that was just on the screen is another one that's a very sacred object according to First Nations. It was when it was discovered the largest meteorite in Canada, but then it was stolen by a missionary and taken to the University of Toronto, my university, about 150 years ago. And it's the only meteorite that is currently being repatriated to its First Nations community. They're building an interpretive center. And the book has an interview with the architect building the interpretive center for this meteorite, which is a spiritual object itself. And so this meteorite is kind of the sacred object within the cosmology of the local indigenous population. But of course, it's also a very important object within our own cosmologies in a scientific process. And I found this object very interesting as a bridging. And when we did the installation in Calgary, there was a caretaker that was an indigenous fellow from the region who kind of took care of it and helped me build the installation. And so it was this lovely kind of moment where we can kind of have an object itself be very important within two cosmological stories itself. And hopefully we could, look at this object as these shared stories and bridges, and respect each other's narratives and stories at the same time as they're not being the same stories. So this meteorite kind of collides into the Earth, and we kind of enter into these volcanic fields. What you're looking at right now, of course, is the Icelandic kind of atmosphere being manipulated by the volcano there. Some kind of long flying shots over the fresh lava field, and the gases escaping from that lava field. And so we set up, again, like I was saying, the birth of the formation of the atmosphere of the Earth. And we look at these kind of these creative destructive forces, because again, meteorites, again, very destructive, but also made way for the place of mammals by killing the dinosaurs. So again, these ideas of endings and beginnings are very similar. They're very much the same. One person's destruction is another person's creation. Our planetary goes through cycles. As we go through another cycle again, it's important for us to kind of understand these ways and complicated narratives, not just from a very simple perspective of an immediate position. This is the Sakurajima volcano in Japan. At one point in the film splits into a mirror image. And what you're seeing kind of in the middle of the film are these mirror images. And the reason for that is because I wanted to use a way in the film that talked about the origin of life, talked about something happening that was order, to shift from a crystalline aspect or from a world that was chaotic of forces of turbulence into something structured, something, in contrast to the entropy of geological time. And that entropy, the opposite of the entropy, of course, is the structure of life. And we're very familiar, just as humans, as bipeds ourselves, as binocular human beings, to look at symmetry kind of twofold. Now, of course, there's more symmetries than just twofold symmetry. There's fourfold, fivefold, and etc. But as a narrative cinematic procedure, we looked at symmetry on a two-level way. And so that symbolized for me kind of the birth and the origin of life. And we just moved through, and I'll kind of skip through. This is a very hypnotic film. And it's half an hour of being immersed in these images. You fly over the face of the Earth as it's being formed, and it ends in the deserts of Namibia, because you actually shift through. The whole film starts with like the freshest Earth in the world of like lava, like coming out of volcanoes, and then it ends in the oldest desert in the world, which is in Namibia itself, the Namib Desert. And we wanted to go there for specific reasons, not only because it's the oldest desert and you see geological time becoming more sedimentary, finally into a desert, but also because of this beautiful meteorite crater, which is in the diamond mining zone, which we had to get special permit to access, because it's usually a natural resource extraction zone. And so this very preserved meteorite, there's only a couple of very perfect meteorite craters in the world. And of course, the desert is the place where something like that would be preserved. But it's also the place where we have our oldest Paleolithic art. And so I was really interested in kind of, again, the origin of life and the origin of consciousness kind of folding with itself, and these beginnings. And the origin of life and the origin of art, of course, happens, I believe, not of course, believes, I think, at the same time. And another expert that I was working with in making the project, and who wrote an essay for the book, is the archaeologist David Lewis William. And he's the fellow who wrote a book called The Mind in the Cave, which really looked at how the earliest works of art that are in caves were not, random scratches. They weren't even just magical hunting kind of aspects, which was popular. They're actually very sophisticated remnants of rituals that happened through a shamanistic and cultural practice. And so, in a certain sense, he's arguing that it is through the hallucinatory rituals within these deep caves, and hallucinatory meaning, in a certain sense, from sensory deprivation, from ingesting something maybe purposely or unpurposely, from certain dietary aspects to music and drumming, whatever it was combined together, the after images of these hallucinations ended up being the art on the walls. And this actually kind of crafted a sense of consciousness. And so we find kind of this narrative resulting at the same time in the cyclical aspect. So we look at the cave art as these kind of constellations, because of course they were some of the first star maps within these caves, and then we kind of loop in the film out. So we kind of come out finally as being seeded from a meteorite from the stars, literally meteorites coming from this celestial place, giving birth to life, and then seeding life, which eventually ends up into kind of humans within these dome structures, these kind of very spiritual spaces, looking out towards the stars again within this dark space. So that was on the top floor, and I'll just kind of close the presentation because the Eye of Silence is really kind of the main part of the narrative. This is just an image of that meteorite, which I ended up constructing as an installation so that it floats above the ground. I was very interested in it before it touched the ground, in a certain sense, before it becomes property, because meteorites become property when they're located on the ground, or whatever who owns that land owns it. So I was very interested in having a meteorite frozen that moment, that's an inch before it hits the ground, and is suspended there. Resisting property is a shared kind of cosmological object. Also, it's just amazing to have this paradox of something that is supposed to come crashing into the earth and floating. And then underneath of that was this 15,000 liter pool of oil, and a special bacteria that eats oil. And so this was this kind of cavernous abigenic oil production of kind of this subterranean life being born, and through the cycle of oil being born out of biomaterial, and then of course biomaterial ingesting and actually eating oil itself. So it was kind of this ecological pool deep underneath. The image you're looking at actually is a little bit faked in the sense that I turned the lights on. Normally in this installation, you walk in, it's completely dark. You only have the light from the entrance. It takes about 5 minutes for your eyes to adjust to the light. A lot of people ended up kind of walking on the gravel, the earth there before realizing they were walking on something. So it was this very, very dark situation. And the back of the image, you see a cavern that this pool goes back into, and it goes back another about 5 meters into that pool, which you can't see the end of. And we had the subwoofers from the film upstairs actually wired into the space. So you had the entire low frequencies of the film, the tectonic kind of shifts of the soundtrack were being played through the space. So you just had this dark rumbling of the kind of the earth playing through that space. I'll end the project with this one last image here, which was it was hung in the subterranean space. And it's called What It's Like to Be a Bat. And I'll just kind of end because everything was a little bit backwards thinking. In the exhibition was all about looking to the past, of this deep time, origin of consciousness, origin of life. And the end of the exhibition, the last piece you didn't see because you couldn't, it was in the dark, but you also couldn't hear it because it's an ultrasonic piece. What you're looking at is not a microphone, it looks like it, but actually it's an ultrasonic speaker. It's used in bat research. And it's playing a sound installation at about 200,000 kilohertz, which is 10 times higher than human hearing. And I use an artificial intelligence trained on my own voice. So I worked with some machine learning to model a voice after myself, which then reads Thomas Nagel's famous essay, What It's Like to Be a Bat, which is about kind of the phenomenological question of shared consciousness. And so I wanted to kind of create this triad between the human, another animal such as the bat, which is a classic kind of trope in philosophy for another consciousness that's impossible to understand, and the birth of a new consciousness through artificial intelligence, and look at kind of a conversation between these three as we kind of look to a future of where we are within our planet. So I'll kind of end it there because I think you guys wanted to be about 45 minutes. I think it's about 45 with the intro. So I'll kind of draw it to a close and answer any questions you guys have. This is the book that's coming out this month with Haji Khan's that documents the project, but also it has a lot of essays in it. Karen Barad wrote an essay for it on cosmology and quantum mechanics. This archaeologist wrote about exactly this, the birth of consciousness in the cave. And I did a bunch of interviews with geoscientists who had discovered the oldest water on the earth for the search of life. The indigenous architect who's building the architecture to house this meteorite that we're talking about, an artificial life professor at the University of Tokyo, who was a colleague of mine this last year, talking about the birth of artificial life that he's been doing for the last 20 years. the head priest of the Zen monk in Kyoto, looking at consciousness and this kind of non-Western idea of subjectivity and idea of intelligence. And the scientist at the ROM who studies meteorites and looking at that. So there's all these kind of different conversations with the different researchers that came into the project that get collected in the book. I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charles. That was so much fun to be a part of. And I'm sure everybody has, there are quite a few people with questions, but I guess I will get the ball rolling. I was curious as to the way you sort of tend to use these words to maybe define a lot of your work, especially with your definition of the word fieldwork, but and also using separating these levels, calling it cosmic, the collision, and chthonic. One was is that something that you consciously make a part of your practice to sort of have these words be a part of it? And also when you are making these definitions, especially like the field work, is that process an additive process, or is it a subtractive process when you're trying to just really define something pertaining to your work?
First question I can answer easily. The second one, maybe we'll have to flesh that out a little bit more, what you're asking.
Okay.
My first degree is in philosophy and actually literature. So I'm a very intertextual practice, definitely. So I'm very conscious of the language, and I'm still writing a lot. So writing is a huge practice. Again, I kind of have there's an essay in the book that's a glossary actually. So it's I think it's about 15 terms. And so instead of it being a curatorial essay or an artist statement, it's actually a glossary of terms like, biosphere, oil, meteorites, caves, hallucinogens. And so each of these terms get kind of fleshed out within a philosophy. So I'm very, very conscious of the terms. I'm very conscious of their history, their etymology, and let's be honest, their poeticness, the cosmic, chthonic, and collision. I'm working with them as poetic terms. So yes, very, very conscious of that. I think they're very important. I'm also constantly in dialogue with literature. Like I say, whether it's the title of a show or really the blueprint of an exhibition being Ballard, in the book that we're looking at on the screen too, there's actually a short story by Clarice Lispector, the Brazilian writer, and the chicken and the egg. And she's really my favorite writer of all time. And so it was a pleasure to work with the estate and include the story, which is very magical, mystical story. So again, the language is very, very important. But I am interested in playing with it, like field, and taking all of these meanings together. I mean, again, I'm less a person that's interested in the technical meanings of words and more in their poetic, overdetermined aspect, within their suggestive nature, within their denotations as much as their connotations. And so field exactly is used so many times, but whether it's a literal field or whether, it's a field as a landscape or whether it's a field of study, all of these meanings for me are important to demonstrate kind of the interdisciplinary nature of the work. Maybe your second question, can you ask me that again? And maybe I'll
yes. Because because of course, when you Google the word fieldwork, that's not the definition that we get. So, and right. The definition that you've created has a lot to do with your work. So I wanted to know, when you're making that definition, is that an additive process, or are you sort of subtracting that definition?
It's definitely additive. It's definitely, I mean, it literally, the idea for the term came out of okay, I'm doing field work in a very normal sense. So I'm going out there and shooting these antennas. I'm actually traversing a landscape. I'm going to these Arctic locations. So under the very traditional term, doing field work. Now I'm making a radio station. Now I'm doing sound recordings and field recordings. So for me, it was just actually a very intuitive process of what I was doing. And then it just, okay, wow, okay, there's a word here that actually collects all the different meanings, one word. And so that was just kind of, I think, a magical situation where it was the additive processes of this interdisciplinary practice, which just came under an umbrella of fieldwork itself. So yeah, I'm definitely not saying that, oh, I'm not doing ethnographic or I'm not doing that. I'm doing this. It more just came out of I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. Here's a great way that I can try to collect it and then try to, you know, define it and push it a little bit more. And then it becomes a feedback loop, of course, at that point.
Right. Thank you so much. And now we can jump on to the audience questions. Does anyone have questions? You can raise your hand or, yep, Josie, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. It was really, really interesting. I just had a question about your discussions around field performance and like the idea of performing with an object. And I was wondering, do you conceive of it as a duet with the space, or more like you sort of putting something into the space? And also, what kind of techniques do you use to interact with the space itself?
You had a quick cutout on the first part. So how do I interact with the space? But what was the first part of the actual question there? You said a word I didn't catch.
Like how do you theorize it? Like, do you theorize the duet
right.
space?
Thanks for that question. So field, this is one of these things where the language just keeps rolling. And field recording, of course, is a very established practice. I think you had Chris Watson, maybe in your talk, you know, amazing, legendary fellow, great guy. So, for instance, you have someone like him who's doing very classical field recordings, and so this is amazing stuff. So I'm kind of borrowing that, and then all of a sudden I realized, okay, I'm doing the field recordings, but now I'm in the same places that I'm doing the concert. And so it just seemed like a natural flip to say, okay, I'm doing field recordings, but I'm not just extracting them out of the landscape and going and making a film, which there's nothing wrong with. And again, that's part of the practice. But I'm actually turning in. And when I started going from using the reverb of a cave to model as a virtual thing, or to extract the sound file as a representative kind of signifier, right? Because that's what field recordings are. The representations, just like a photograph. And so I was interested not just in kind of this photo safari aspect of field recording, but now I'm in the actual location of these caves and cenotes and doing concerts in them. And so for me, it seemed natural to just kind of extend the language into that and say, okay, I'm doing field recording, but now I'm doing field performances, and I'm using these spaces in real time, as much as I'm looking them as representational spaces. So at that point, it's really, and it seemed natural to me because actually my master's thesis was in sound and architecture. And so I really looked at how sound shapes our concepts of our sense of space, and how space creates our sense of sound. And that this combination was kind of what my thesis was about. And so it was very natural for me to go from kind of just the headphone field recording, thinking about space and doing the concerts. And I really try to do concerts in architecture interesting spaces. It's always been, I don't go on tour. I kind of accept performances when I find the architecture interesting, whether it's an industrial site, whether it's an interesting, you know, kind of concert hall or planetarium, or whether it's this geological space. So I was already looking at the architectural acoustics of spaces for performances. So when I started doing them in the landscape itself, that became a way to talk about it. In ways of actually engaging it, it's the acoustics. I'm looking at the reverbs. I'm looking at the resonances. So I do a lot of performances of feedback where actually I'm sculpting the sound according to the resonant frequencies of that space, kind of like an Alvin Lucier, if you know him, and his sound work at all. I actually worked with Alvin Lucier before he died at the Atlantic Center for the Arts. He was kind of a mentor for me. So this direct aspect of architectural acoustics as a compositional element is very important. I was also Armory Schaefer's TA in graduate school, and Armory Schaefer is the famous fellow who invented the word soundscape with the World Soundscape Studies. So looking at acoustic ecologies, the field he actually started. So these were kind of my mentors coming out of that, and fed into these actual performances. So very, very direct lineage to some composers in the 20th century.
That was fantastic. Thank you. I'll look that up.
No problem.
Awesome. Do we have anyone else with a question? Vivek.
Vivek.
Hi, I mean that was like a lot of stuff to
Yeah.
process. I think. Yeah, I think I'm still like, kind of stuck in the recent past and like lingering on most of the things which you have said. But like, yeah, thank you for so many names. I mean, we have a lot to unpack. But like, I'm not sure if my first question is very correct me if I'm wrong, because when you were like kind of exploring the shape of domes, at one time did you mention horse cars, which is like a neighborhood in Delhi? Or like, or maybe I got it wrong, because there's like a lot of old Mughal architecture, and like as we all know, that dome is a very integral part of Islamic architecture. So like my question was more kind of in a sense of like, in the current political distressful situations in many nations, like specifically I come from India, and I see that there's this kind of this attack on history in which people are either claiming some piece of architecture or like damaging them.
Yeah.
So like I think I'm just really curious, like how you, because if I disassociate the political scenario, then I can obviously look at through a different lens. But like, how do you kind of, marry both the concepts? Like, suppose you go at a place which has a really dark past, or it is subjected to a lot of political turmoil. So how do you incorporate these elements in your work, or you try to step back?
No, that's a great question. Thank you for that, because it's these difficult things to wrestle with, I think, as artists, especially these days, are important. My partner's actually from Iran, and so I was looking more at Isfahan and the dome, Islamic architecture as through that landscape. That's what was in the actual book. But I think these questions, what I didn't share today actually was most of my, this is a strange project for me, in the sense that it's not very political. And I think that maybe comes out of COVID and this idea of nature, but the majority of my work is actually very much military research. So the DO line, which we kind of started with, I kind of took an alternative thing. I talked a little bit about Buckminster Fuller and replacing him in a military history and the dark aspect of that, instead of the celebratory. But actually, a lot of the other exhibitions I have is on military outpost architecture, military intelligence. So whether it's forensics or whether it's a kind of military history, it's a very dark history. Whether it's military colonialism in the Arctic, again, very dark. So I think if you just saw this talk today, you maybe would get a strange perception of me but I think you've sensed it at the same time, maybe, that I think it's important for artists to look at that. There's two questions to that. One is, how do you deal with it psychologically as an artist? And the other is, how do you deal with it as an artwork and a practice in an exhibition? Sometimes it's harder than others to look at the material very personally. In an exhibition, it's a very research-based practice. And so that's why the books are very important. I always usually write my own didactics. And so I don't really draw a distinction. I find what we might call exhibition prosthetics, to use a Joseph Grizzly term, is important. And so again, like the first question we had, writing is very important for me. And so I don't, I'm kind of also, someone looks at my exhibitions, they're like, whoa, okay, why are these didactics? And then they start to realize they're not your normal ones. They're not your educational ones that are slapped on there for the, okay, hi, the artist was born in this date, or this is how you might imagine this, they're not didactics to broaden it to kind of the lowest common denominator. They're texts that are part of the exhibition. They're part of the important contextualization. And I think that I've always found that an important aspect in my work, whether it's actually in the exhibition itself as part of the exhibition design, or whether it's the publications or the programming that go around it. And I think that's really important to have, partly because it's not easy. And I think the artwork is poetic. The artwork tries not to be didactic itself. It allows for complexity within its affect. But at the same time, that's dangerous. And when you're doing certain political things. So hopefully the writing allows for complexity in position. And so I think that's what, as artists, are some tools we have, instead of just being political activism or journalistic writing, where you need to be direct and the political message needs to be clear. I think as artists, you have these two options. You have within the work itself, these moments of being, okay, we can present a complexity that resonates, that can be looked at from different sides. Think of it as an object, and one person can see it from this side, one person can see on that side, and they see something else. And then the writing allows you to look at things from different sides. And so I think these two types of positionality are important when dealing with darker and more politically fraught subjects.
Thank you so much. Do we have time if I can ask another, like, a bit?
Almost coming to the end, but slip it in there quickly.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you can elaborate, like, I really loved, but I think you just like retracted your thought when you were talking about how the meteor, if it will hit the ground,
Yeah.
it will be a case of ownership, like then someone owns it.
Yeah.
But when it's like slightly, and then you were kind of jumping to how Earth, in a way, is also like, so like can you just elaborate this entire phenomenology of ownership and like how you place, specifically in an ecological crisis, and we are all kind of trying to understand like wealth ownership, resource ownership. Can you propose an idea, or can you elaborate a bit more on that concept of land and ownership?
Well, coming from Canada, it's very complicated. I mean, we're a colony here as well of the British Empire, so it has a long fraught history of resource extraction, which continues today by the settler colonialism. So that's very much here. So I think the idea of solutions to these issues is very much obviously based on the commons. It's not like, I don't believe in a quick romantic origin to a past time. I mean, we have to look forward, I think, trying to think, oh, we decolonize and suddenly everything's solved. And that's not a solution itself. We need to navigate these things through complicated negotiations, through respecting of treaties, but also planning together with people. And so I think that's what's kind of important about that. I just wrote a text that's coming out with Alou Shah on geosolar engineering. And so I think, again, these ideas of borders make less and less sense. So not only in the sense of a colonial aspect of claiming a border and claiming land, let's say, leading up to the 20th century, but actually the future. These borders don't make any sense anymore, whether it's carbon, whether it's pollution, whether it's climate, it doesn't respect national borders. So again, this concept of private property on a micro level of the individual, the corporate, doesn't make sense even on a national level. These things, I think we're very aware now, have to be dealt with collectively.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.
I think we're not too bad on time. Thank you so much, Charles, for this wonderful opportunity to sort of attend this lecture. It's been great. There's so much. I have a notebook full of notes to jump into right after this. And to everyone here, we do want to remind everybody that on November 16th at the same time, we'll be having Elizabeth Hanaf and Daniel Grushkin, a computational biologist and the executive director of the Biodesign Challenge, for an online lecture here at Fabrica. But to everybody who joined, and of course the Fabricanti, thank you so much for joining, and have a great week ahead.